I'm so excited today that we have with us in this session of HR for Her, Ashanti Bintil Dew. And she
Yes.
is based in London, in the United Kingdom, in London. And we are excited to have her here talking to us about the 100 Women Project. She's a co-founder of this project, which is teaching white women in corporate and organizations how to be allies for the Black community. So before we get into her work, I just want to ask her one question. What does gender diversity mean to you, Ashanti?
So thank you so much for having me here. Really happy to share and add value. So that's a really great question. I think definitely in terms of my practice, it's about creating equity for all genders, essentially. So each individual shouldn't be defined by their gender in terms of the opportunities that are available to them, the access that is available to them, and the levels to which they can ascend if they are happy, willing, and wanting to do the work to get there. So that's what gender diversity to me means. It's the eradication, really, of barriers, bias, and prejudice, preventing anyone from being able to progress in their career.
I like that. I love that you talk about the eradication, because that's so important. And it ties into really, a little bit of your work. So let's talk
Yes.
about your work, the 100 White Women.
Yes.
How did this organization, how did you co-found it? How did it start? And, what are you set out to do? What's the mission?
Absolutely. So the mission was to, teach as many white women as possible how to demonstrate anti-racist ideas, beliefs, and behaviors in the workplace, and how to be allies to their women of color and Black women specifically peers in the workplace. Here in the UK, 83% of HR, so that's human resources, are female and they're white. That's a high number. In addition to that, we know when it comes to gender diversity conversations that are happening, white women are ascending faster than any other group. Okay, and so that means that they're getting into those rooms, onto those C-suites, into the boardrooms quicker than other groups within the workplace. And so our rationale is if we can impact at this stage their thinking and their concept of allyship, that could be really powerful as they ascend into those places, because they will be able to, within their sphere of influence, bring other women of color along with them.
And so the expectation, is it for the women who are in your community of the 100 White Women, is it for them to become allies, or also for them to teach other women to be allies? And before you answer that question, I would love for you just to define what allies means and allyship means to you.
Absolutely, that's a good question. So again, the work that we do is all about organizational health. So we tend to focus on allyship within the workplace, particularly in these three key areas. One, if you are a senior leader. Two, if you are a manager, and by that I mean a people manager. And three, if you are an employee and maybe you have team members. So you may not have authority or position over people, but you are a part of a community and your behavior impacts the other people in that community. So allyship, when we use that term, directly and specifically refers to behaviors, ideas, and beliefs in the workplace.
Okay, and so now you're building this community, teaching them new behaviors,
Yes.
helping for them to form new ideas in the workplace. And tell us, how do you go about doing this in this community that you have? What are you actually teaching them about being
Sure.
allies?
At the lowest level, okay, what we start with are safe space conversations that are no blame, no shame conversations, right? What we ask the participants to come to the workshops and the conversations with is vulnerability, transparency, and a willingness to listen and learn. So what we do in those conversations is explore what systemic racism is. And of course, that often leads on to talking about things like privilege. Okay, and then once we explore those terms, those concepts, etc., we then move into talking about how women can use their sphere of influence with this new understanding. And one of the things we'll say is, bear in mind, it is a journey. So these things don't just happen within half an hour. But
Yeah.
what we do is we start that journey with them and accompany them, so that they can deal with a lot of the emotions and the questions that can come up on that journey. And what we've done is accompanied those workshops and conversations with a self-reflective journal. It's one of a kind journal that is a combination of provoking questions and then some audio recordings from the facilitators
Hmm.
that really try to get the participants to dig deeper and think about their ideas and beliefs, where they come from, and how they can de-bias some of those beliefs over time. So that's what we do at the most basic level, is workshops within corporations, with participants who are in managerial and leadership positions, so that they can think about the impact that their behavior has on the people they're managing.
And so now you talked at the beginning about you targeted that it's 100 white women and that 80% of the seats in human resources are held by white women. Now,
Yes.
that is very true, but we're also, you talked about teaching the senior leaders, and that's a whole different demographics. And
Yes.
so when you're doing these workshops, are you inviting the senior leaders who are non-white women also to join these workshops?
Absolutely. So 100 White Women really started, literally, we started with 100 White Women, and it just became a hashtag, and kind of the name of the overall campaign. But the reality of the work we do is we work with predominantly white workforces. That means that all genders are welcome on the workshops. But an inherent part of, as you know, affecting any change of this type when it comes to the culture of an organization is having the buy-in and support of senior management and the board.
Yes.
So that is a foundational piece in the programs that we run with corporations. Senior managers and board members are invited actually to their own discrete safe space conversation. What we want to do and what we aim to do is get them to get their ducks in a row, maybe explore some of their own ideas and beliefs first, before we work with the general employee cohort. And what that does is, first of all, it gives senior team members a chance to do some work on themselves without the glare of the general employee cohort. And so they can then, after those sessions, they can decide on a way forward and present that to the general employee cohort to build trust, and an element of transparency about them recognizing that they also have to do some work and understand the dynamics at play before they expect their employees to start exhibiting these new, healthier behaviors and attitudes. And so we work with them separately first, and then depending on what the corporation wants, they will at times when it's appropriate also participate in the workshops that we're running with the general employee cohort.
And it's really critical to have the leadership actually model. I know a lot of times in
Yes,
organizations, the leaders are paying for the training, but they're not attending the training,
yes,
and their behavior is also contradictory to what's also happening in the training. And so,
absolutely.
so when we talk about allies, and you selected the white women because they were actually sitting in the human resources seats, what has been their response after the workshop, or
Mm.
to the fact of now being allies? And is it just for Black women, or is it entirely to the Black community?
So that's really, really interesting. So, first of all, one of the things we recognize is the power of friendship and network between women. You know, we see it when it comes to the online business world. We see it when it comes to mothers who get together, you know, and they network very well, right? Word of mouth, they'll share the best club for their children, they'll share the latest exercise regime, etc. There is a power and strength when women are bonding, when women connect with each other. And so the idea was, and what works really well when we see the light bulb switch on, is when we start exploring with sometimes the female participants how they feel about their friends and how important friendship is to them in and out of work. And then we start asking them, well, how many Black friends do you have? How many Black colleagues do you have? Do you speak to your Black colleagues often? When you're recommending people for extra projects, when you are commending or spotlighting colleagues who've done work well, are any of those individuals Black? And what that does is you've explored how important friendship is to them. You've explored what it feels like for them maybe to be misunderstood, dismissed, marginalized, ignored. And then when we then say, okay, well, let's have a think about your interaction or lack thereof maybe with your Black colleagues. How do you think that makes them feel? How do you think it makes your Black team members feel when you have not maybe conducted the appraisal with transparency, when they don't get that pay rise or that promotion, when actually they have demonstrated they're able to get that? And so what we do is really seat it in experiences that are human, that we all can relate to. And then we obviously add that extra layer in to help them understand maybe what their Black peers, whether they're female or male, may well be experiencing in the workplace. So it's a combination of that data that we know exists and the research, but really getting them to dig deeper on the human experience for them. So what usually happens, to your question about the impact of the workshops on the participants, is there are different types of people who come along, but one distinct type is a participant who is vulnerable, ready to be vulnerable, and wants to learn. Now, that participant with those two ingredients has the most success after these workshops, because they're willing to dig deep on themselves and discuss and think about what they could be doing better. They're aware that they don't know a lot, and so they're there to listen and learn. And they have the willingness and intention to make healthy adjustments. They're the ones, a lot of the key words that we receive with the feedback is healing, bonding, enlightening, empowering. Because a key part of the workshops that we really focus on is, after we've taken them through that journey, we talk about how they can make their privilege a power, okay? So instead of inciting guilt or shame or blame in these sessions, what we get them to do, once they understand what their privilege looks like for them, but maybe even the disadvantage that their Black peers may have in the workplace, we start working on how they can use the power in knowing that you now have this privilege. How can you use that as a leader, as a manager, effectively to create equity in your workplace for your Black fellow peers?
I have so many questions out of that one thing, but I'm going to try to limit it. So you talked about a lot of things about, changing their behavior, changing the way they're thinking. And so when I think about that, I think about the cultural part of what we need to do in terms of diversity. When we talk about unconscious bias and implicit bias, that's the cultural part. Allyship is the cultural part. But you're talking to HR people who also have their hand in the systemic part and the infrastructural, the institutional part of discrimination. And so once they get this enlightenment, like you said, the healing, the bonding, what are they doing to go back and make adjustments in policies or practices to now correct some of these things that they realize have been impeding their Black colleagues?
Yes, absolutely. So what has been happening is that we, of course, get people approaching us to do deeper work with their organization as a whole. Suddenly they recognize that, to your point, systems, processes, and policies also need to change. Because as much as we as individuals might get to a place of understanding and knowing, we are still all operating within a system that is deeply entrenched. And yes, it was designed to exclude large groups of other people. And so what we do tend to see people start doing is looking at things like gender pay gap, ethnicity pay gaps. Suddenly people look at their hiring and recruitment strategies and policies. And really importantly, one thing we talk about is that internal talent development. What is happening in that area? And one of the things that they suddenly realize with our guidance is that instead of thinking about this as a problem that needs to be solved, it's about thinking about it as if this cohort of employees are an underutilized resource. It's the mindset shift. And for businesses, when it comes to the commercials, when they start thinking about resources that they are paying for but aren't using, it certainly nudges them to start changing policies, processes, and systems that may not be as effective as they thought. And so what we work on is helping them understand these are underutilized resources,
Yeah.
okay? This is a business performance metric. And like any other metric, if it were failing, you would invest in improving that metric. And so, there are various things that people need to do, but, changing policies and systems and procedures is really important. But let's be honest, unless you understand as an individual why it's important and then you're motivated to do that, those systems and procedures don't get changed.
So, so I love that they're actually attacking it from both ways, because I'm a firm believer that you cannot just do one without the other. We need to
Yes.
attack these problems from both sides. So our community of diversity listeners are hearing what you're saying. They're saying, well, I love this idea of, dealing with the HR people and teaching them to be allies who will go out and now can build a whole ally community or show within their organization how to be allies. You have the senior leaders involved. So if someone wanted to do such a project, I mean, how do they start? I mean, you started this hashtag, white 100 white women. If someone else is now been challenged, because I don't know about you, but for me, I'm getting so many requests, because of what's happening in terms of, we want to be allies, we want to have ERGs, all these conversations are coming up. And so where would be the first step if someone is saying, hey, I want to either be an ally? So let's start with that. I want to be an ally. What's the first step that I need to do to become an ally?
Sure. I think the first step is the listening and learning part, right? It's now is the time to start listening. So go out there and depending on who you are, so if you are if you're a manager or a leader in particular and you want to be an ally, find your peers, seek out your peers and networks that are in the diversity and inclusion space, who can hold safe space for you to explore and express your feelings and thoughts, and who are willing to educate you to some extent on what the dynamics at play are, what the issues are, some of the lived experiences. You have to start by listening. And I do find that when you start in that place, what happens is people start to develop empathy. And that empathy then moves them to learn more. And in that process, they will it's a hard journey, but they will learn how to become an ally. And I guess allies become such a buzzword, but what we're really talking about is changing ideas and beliefs that disadvantage other people. That's it. So it's really about that processes of undoing, unlearning, unpacking unhealthy ideas and beliefs that drive the decisions that you're making in the workplace. And so that's that journey they need to go on. Now that might involve engaging external facilitators and experts like yourself, like the other organizations that might be in their state, in their town, in their country, because it's not work that can be done necessarily by yourself, especially if you didn't realize you had a problem or you're not sure how deep that problem goes. You will have to engage expertise that can guide you in a structured way in terms of becoming an ally.
And so now, so now you're saying what I need to be an ally. Now, if I want to teach other people how to be allies, should it happen through workshops? Like, what do we do? How do we now build this ally community? And does that even make sense?
That's a good question. I think, look, one thing that's clear, and that's why I love what you're doing, right? And the fact that, you're creating a resource for diversity consultants, because there are so many facets to this work. And so we have to, I think when it comes to again, separating out as an individual person, it's a beautiful thing if you want to teach somebody else how to be an ally. I think as an individual, the best way to do that is to be an example, because we're all human. We will make mistakes and we're all flawed. And so I always steer away from positioning oneself maybe as a role model or, some sage advice. I would suggest just do your best, try your best in your daily life on a daily basis, and your example is enough for others.
Great.
But if we're talking about in the professional setting, and as I say, if you've got responsibility for a team, a group of people, if you're a manager or senior leader, then absolutely, it is imperative really that you model healthy allyship. And I said healthy, not perfect, but healthy, transparent allyship. And if in that case you engage experts, I genuinely believe in engaging experts for this work because, and we see it happen quite often with some of the corporations we work with, there's also a heavy burden sometimes that lays on the person who is doing the teaching as well. And so when you engage external facilitators, it allows you to also benefit from those learnings as well, right? So that's my advice. I think we have to be very careful. It's so early days for a lot of people. And that includes some of our Black peer D&I practitioners as well, right? You know, when you mentioned earlier about unconscious bias training, that's something as a practice that we've never done because we don't believe in unconscious bias training. But we've seen over the last 4 months, there's been somewhat of a 360 turn happening where people are not talking about unconscious bias training, we're talking about anti-racism, okay? And so everyone's going through a transition and figuring out how this really works. And so I do always steer clear of, you know, encouraging people to position themselves as teachers to others, because right now, you know, the dust hasn't settled yet. So allow yourself to keep learning and upskilling yourself as a practitioner or as a manager or a senior team leader so that you can make mistakes, okay? And you can, you know, win the grace of your team in those circumstances. So I think that it's really important to be aware of that.
And I think you said some really key words as a healthy ally, because you're not going to be perfect. This is a very evolving work. It's constantly changing. Even as an ally, there's so many things that you're learning, and it's very key, like you said, to listen and learn. There's so many things you're learning about that community that you are, you know, want to be an ally to. And as you're learning about that community, you probably will make a, you know, a couple of blunders here and there, but it's important also to forgive yourself, you know, have grace with yourself, to forgive yourself, and don't allow that to stop you from being an ally. If you,
absolutely,
you know, you kind of blow it. So I love the fact that you're building this whole community of women. We've heard in the past from one of our, you know, our past speakers that, you know, white women have not been great allies to Black women. So it's great that you're actually building a community where people are learning to be allies. And I don't know, you know, why they haven't been great allies in the past, but you're hitting almost two, as we would say, two problems with one nail. You know, you're helping, you're going to the person who has the power, the HR, you're going to the white woman who has not traditionally been a great ally for Black women, and getting her on board. And you're also getting her on board, not just as a person, but as a leader who can also take other people. So I love what your project is doing. And how it's expanding. You started out with 100, I can't, it's 100,000 women
I know
who are becoming allies. It's important, and not just allies for the Black community. You know, there's allyship is important for all communities, you know, of various identities, especially, you know, women. So I just love that. So before you go, I just would like to ask you a few questions. We always like to ask our guests. If you had the HR, the diversity magic wand, what would be the one policy that you would love to implement, that you would just implement immediately?
I think it would be, well, I know it would be. So all the data and research really points to the need for all managers to have coaching abilities. And so it would definitely be to make sure that all managers, all senior leaders undergo bias and coaching courses. Currently at the moment, leadership and managerial courses, programs, they don't really touch upon bias. They don't touch upon anti-racism, for example, or any anti-anything, right? They're very logistical and probably quite technical. And data and research has shown that there is a 77% improvement in team well-being when the managers and the senior leaders have coaching abilities. Their style of management is coaching, okay? And imagine the power of those two things. If you have those coaching abilities with that awareness of bias, that could be really powerful for the workplace as we see it today.
And I'm not really sure why anybody is a manager who couldn't coach. So that is that is so important. That is so important. And then definitely, linking it with that bias part is very critical, because we have heard that African American women are not getting the candid support that they need because their managers don't know how to deliver it. We also know, because of the Me Too women movement, that women are also not getting as much coaching as they used to historically in the past, because men just don't know how to manage that. And it's not saying that all women are great coaches, but we know that first we have data to show that those two areas have been a challenge for us. That's really good. So one other thing we want to ask you, so what would be your hashtag for gender diversity?
Oh, wow. Equity first.
Equity first.
Yes.
Oh, I love that. So I'm going to make you explain that. So why equity first? I'm not just going to let you give us the hashtag and go.
It's the key. As soon as you create equity, then everybody has an opportunity, a chance to thrive. And that's the reality. And so, that's what we should be focusing on, even before we talk about diversity and inclusion. If everyone at that table believes that equity comes first, is deserved, is a non-negotiable, then the rest of the conversation is more about, well, what are we putting in place? It's not a debate anymore. The conversation becomes, a living, breathing discussion. So that's why equity first.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Phil. So how would our audience, if they wanted to reach out to you and get more information on the hashtag,
100 White Women,
how would they?
So come and find me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn every single day. Come and find me on LinkedIn, say hello, and we'll share some details about the project.
Well, stay safe, and we wish you the best. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.